Hello, everyone, and welcome to another week of Mastering Dungeons. I'm Shawn Merwin here with Teos Abadia. Hey, Teos.
Hey, Shawn. How are you doing, my friend?
I am a functioning adult, at least on paper.
Congratulations. That's a big step for you.
It is. I've been upgraded from a functioning toddler.
I've
got that going for me.
My goal is always to get back to the toddler stage because that was really fun.
It was. Those were the days.
Yeah, it's good. Instead of all this responsibility. Whew. But you know what?
Yep.
I like games.
I do. I like games too. So let's talk about games to take our minds off of our adulthood.
Yeah.
The first news is the second version, or the second article in the D&D Studio blog series is up, and it is by Wes Snyder, senior game designer, and lead on the book that we're going to talk about this week, Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. So in that post, he talks about horror in D&D games, goes back, looks at its history, looks at what they were doing when they concepted and then designed the new book. And overall, it was a pretty interesting read. These are the kinds of things I like to read when I read a blog about game design. You know, it's not necessarily overly detailed, but it also, gets into sort of, this is what we were thinking and this was the outcome. And it helps me as a game designer see where they started, where they ended up, and I can sort of follow the steps in between.
Yeah, it was interesting to read this. It felt a little bit sales-ish to me. But I wondered, I mean, basically when I got to the end of the article, I was like, did I like this? Did I not? Like, I definitely love seeing design concepts, and I really like what they did here to talk about the sort of history of Ravenloft and how it kind of pulled off what it's done in the past, and to accept what D&D is as compared to other games, because by now I think most folks who are fairly involved in the industry understand that there are these other types of approaches, very different approaches to horror games, whether it's a crumbling Jenga tower or candles that are slowly being put out, and those kinds of approaches allow you to tell completely different stories in different ways, and sometimes that can feel more fitting to horrors, and certainly is more fitting to certain types of horror. So, what is it that D&D is, and how they went about trying to do that? And I thought that was awesome. But sometimes it felt like, and in chapter 5 of the book you also want, it felt a little bit like that at times.
Yeah, it was, but it sort of, that's the point, right? It's like, hey, here's this cool thing we made. Let me talk about it, why it's so great. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that.
Cool.
And a lot of the points that I would discuss in this article, we're going to discuss as we get into discussing the book itself. So I would be fine to sort of just skip it for now, and then we'll get to it, and we can refer back to it, back to this article as we talk about chapter 4, since we're going to jump ahead and talk about this running horror games approach, which I think is the best place to start as far as I'm concerned. They also added something to Dragon Plus. Do you want to talk about that? We've already discussed issue 37, but now they've added content.
I'm really quite sure that this, which is, I don't know if this happening before, there is just another article as part of issue 37, because I went back over my notes and it wasn't there, and I don't think this was there. So there is now a new article in issue 37 that tells us all about the Underdark and secrets of the Drow, and it links to the video we talked about last week. But it also kind of rewrites or frames in slightly different ways the news of the different types of Drow, and that's kind of a big focus of this article. So the concept is that Lolth has been running a misinformation campaign, and we've all fallen prey to it. So she convinced Menzoberranzan's Uda Drow that they were the only Drow, and that there are no Drow above ground, but that is actually not true. So the reality is now, in this edition, that Menzoberranzan is a splinter group. I find so much of this fascinating. I'm just going to get through what it says. So then it says, the Uda Drow, it talks a little bit about the design, where they thought about how there are these two other groups, but there are possibly others. Two such groups, not the only groups, are the Aven Drow and the Loren Drow, which are also known as Starlight Elves and Green Shadow Elves. So the Starlight Elves, or Aven Drow, remained above ground, follow their moral compasses north, vanish from history behind curtains of snow, aurora, and illusion. And they are secretive clans steeped in magic. The memory of glittering bastion of Caladay somehow escapes even within the longest lived of elves. And, we're kind of teased a bit that, maybe we'll learn more about this place in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. And what about the Loren Drow?
Yeah, so these Green Shadow Elves are another band. They also remain above ground and sought a new homeland in the towering forest to the south, which could kind of be a lot. Like, this could be Schultz if you want to go into the Zendrick type angle of design. Or, right. There are a lot of great forests along the Sword Coast. I assume we're still talking Sword Coast. Certain histories imagine these learned out to be living in a verdant city that straddles rivers with airy bridges and winds around trunks as grand as cathedrals. Considered in many circles to be a case of scholastic fancy gone rogue, these historians have named the Loren Drow homeland Seikalath, or Place of Shade. And then we get some art, and we're told that some of Lolth's Drow like to have body markings, which seem to be like tattoos, but are maybe more than that. It wasn't entirely clear, as a sign of her favor. So I guess that means that sometimes you would know this is a Lolthite because of the markings, but not all Lolthites have markings, so it's just a thing that can sometimes be used in the art. What do you think about all this?
Well, I'm wondering, I put on my business hat, and I'm wondering if, obviously, this is not the history that we know from, AD&D days when
right.
The Drow were first introduced in Greyhawk, of all places. But times as they are, this lore needs to be updated for obvious reasons. Yeah. And so, I'm wondering if this is all we're going to see of this, or if we're going to see not just role-playing game products, but also video games and also, other aspects of content delivery being created to enforce and reinforce this knowledge. I would hope that the latter is true, that they don't just put this out there and then say, okay, we're done. I hope that they build on it and make a great story from this, rather than just applying the Band-Aid and then letting it go from there.
I think you're right, because of the videos they've shared where they clearly involved R.A. Salvatore, and he's been instrumental in the in any Forgotten Realms view, and really all of D&D's view of what Drow are. His words have defined Drow culture, and so now he's going back. I think with this misinformation, it allows him to tell a story. The bits that have been out there make me think that his novel that's coming out will include these aspects, which tells me that they've been at the meeting board for a while, right, thinking through how do we do this, and making sure that it's in concert with his works. So I think we're really looking at the lore that D&D will now use, and if we ever do get a Greyhawk, I bet it will involve this aspect as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So it's a good addition. If you've already read Dragon Magazine for this issue, go on back and check out this article. The D&D Adventures League has released a fundraising bundle for Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. 18 adventures from Guild Adepts and CCC programs, showcasing Asian American, and Pacific Islander authors. There are quite a few. I think
this might have ended by the time this airs, but because I've seen some tweets suggesting that the end is near for this bundle. But what I really like is the interviews. Mm-hmm. And those, I think, are still, folks, even if you can't get the bundle, go check out the Yawning Portal blog, because that's really cool. And there's some really neat people that are interviewed there. They have a little kind of paragraph piece talking about their backgrounds and just showcasing the diversity of the writers that are in our hobby. Many of whom are also in the Adventurers League side of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and
we
includes,
had one. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, we had one of the authors, Marcelo de Velasquez, on our show when we went through the Rime of the Frost Maiden episode, where we had other people come in and talk about their experiences DMing. So it was great to have him on the show, and it's great to see him being highlighted here on the Awning Portal blog. We also heard from some of our friends, Jay Africa, Kat Kruger, Lisa Penrose, many other excellent authors were highlighted for this. So if it's not still up, as Teos said, at least go check out their work and support them via other ways if you can.
Yeah.
We have more Magic the Gathering D&D card set news. There is now a dungeon mechanic involved. I did not read about this, so I'm going to let Teos explain.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like we know much, but I guess a variant of a card was posted by an artist, and that variant has some keywords on it. It mentions venture into a dungeon, so it's if you've done this. And then it also has a keyword that activates if the player has completed a dungeon. So if you've completed a dungeon, you gain flying. And so we don't know what it exactly means, but it is cool to be like, all right, there's a new mechanic that will be in the D&D card set that will involve this sort of go into dungeons and benefit from it. So that's kind of neat.
That's interesting. Huh. I don't even know a lot about Magic, but I could see that being very cool. Playing a dungeon against your opponent, and they can't do anything until they go through the dungeon. Or having land that is a dungeon would be interesting as well.
Right. Ooh. Yeah, I'm curious how it works. I used to play a collectible card game for Shadowrun. I was stupidly into it, spent way too much. That was my money spent. It wasn't Magic, it was Shadowrun. And they had a mechanic where you would go on a shadow run. And so each player had a kind of essentially a dungeon card or a mission card, actually up to 3. And you'd put them out there and then you'd trap them. And that was a lot of fun to sort of like, force players to go there when they weren't prepared and things like that.
Nice. Interesting. Well, I never thought I would hear these words coming out of my mouth, but I'm really interested in playing Magic the Gathering soon.
Yeah.
Good times.
Me too.
Speaking of good times, the Arcadia Issue 4 is now available. We have the return of Willie Abiel for more mounts in an article called Swimming Through Sand to Sea. So he had mounts in his previous adventure or his previous article, and now he has mounts like the Chull, the Bulette, the Juvenile Purple Worm, the Axolotl, and so on. And magic items to help bring mounts into dungeons, which is, always playing the Cavalier back in the day. It was always like, you have all these benefits while you're mounted, and oh, by the way, you now have to crawl down this, 4-foot diameter hole. So sorry about that.
Yeah.
What other articles did you note?
I mean, so that one has a lot of very funny puns. There's jokes about a little axolotl and a lot of axolotl. But there is a very cool adventure, The Chained Library, written by Kat Evans. And this is a place where, in this library, they guard tomes that are too dangerous for mortal eyes. And so, of course, that's the kind of thing adventurers have to go check out.
Yes.
And then Derek Ruiz, who we recently talked about, just last week we mentioned him as one of the authors that I thought had a really cool adventure in Candlekeep Mysteries. That was his first publication through Wizards. Now we see him writing for MCDM. And these are 5 encounters you can drop into your game as the characters travel from one place to another on the road encounters. So this is great. Arcade, I think, usually is going to have 3 articles, which I think is a great, it's still an unbelievable steal. Sometimes you get 4, but these are 3 really neat encounters. And the art is, as always, just unbelievable. Like the pictures of the mount, I've got them up on my screen right now. And like the mount, the purple worm mount is, it's just great. It's just wonderful art. All of the art, the cover, everything is just fantastic, and the entrance to the chain library, just beautiful. I love everything about Arcadia.
Yeah. Excellent. And some other articles to take note of are coming out from Kobold Press. Two friends of the show, Celeste Conowitch and Greg Marks, have articles. Celeste writes about playing with class, and this one is called Forge, a Fabulous Fighter, where she covers how to play a fighter and outlines various options. And then Greg Marks writes another in his Trapmaster series, this one on incremental traps. Traps that have phases which activate when adventurers take certain actions. So, for example, if a room is filling up with lava and the players break the walls rather than climb up, then more lava begins pouring in. So those two articles are up at the Kobold Press website. Any thoughts on those?
Yeah, it's been both these have been great series. Like the Play with Class does a really nice job of getting you started with a particular class. So if you're new to the game or if you've never played a particular class, this is a really useful series. And the traps are just, it's great insight and also very evil insight. I mean, I was reading this latest article and it's hilarious how Greg will kill you with lava.
Yeah. Many ways to die with lava.
Yeah. Many ways to die. The floor is lava.
Yep. And along the Kobold Press lines, there is an article. It's not put up by Kobold Press, but it mentions Kobold Press's product, Empire of the Ghouls. Richard Green was the lead designer of that product, and now he's starting a blog series on how to run Empire of the Ghouls by borrowing ideas from Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft to enhance gameplay by adding that extra touch of horror. And I know that we've covered the Empire of the Ghouls, not in depth, but we've mentioned it on other episodes. A great product from Kobold Press, really cool setting and adventure to go along with it. And it fits right into this sort of horror genre that Van Richten's delivers. So the lead designer of the Empire of the Ghouls, Richard Green, again, is sharing his insights and his suggestions on melding the two to make the best possible horror campaign for your money. So that's at richardgreengames.com. Yeah.
Very cool. I love it when you get a lead author like that, just peeling things back, right, and looking at how a product can apply to something else. That's a really neat perspective. So I'm looking forward to this. This one's on character options. But yeah, I'm excited to see how he applies all of the Ravenloft, Van Richten's content to it.
Mm-hmm. And our last bit of news here is Grant Ellis has launched a 10-minute tabletop talk. What are the details on this?
Yeah, so he is Grant Ellis is a renowned game designer and streamer. He is on the Twitters heavily, and he's often behind the scenes on live play games. If you're watching a stream and you're like, how does that just all work? All these little boxes and the people and how do splash screens come up? And so he's one of the people who's often producing that effect behind the scenes. He was also the author of Grimworld, which is a setting that was done for 2C Gaming as one of their Kickstarters. And recently he launched a podcast that is on YouTube that does a quick 10-minute interview with someone about a topic. There are many fun episodes out there already. One near and dear to my heart, because I like the Gumshoe system and I like Rudy Basso, is Rudy Basso and Grant talking about Gumshoe and what they like about it. And it's fun. I mean, it's just the 10 minutes goes by so quickly. So it's just a fun. You can just dip in, hear one person's perspective on one topic, and before you know it, it's done. It's cool. I
am bookmarking that as we speak. Awesome. Yeah. So that was our news this week, and now we are going to dip into Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. We're going to jump around. We're not going to go straight through chapter by chapter. We're going to jump from chapter to chapter in an order that we think best fits our reading schedule and how to digest the content therein. And because of that, we're going to start with chapter 4, which talks about running a horror adventure or running a horror campaign. But first, we will give an overview of what's in the book. But before we do that, we want to talk about the tone that we're going to take for these these talks about Van Richten's guide. So the first thing we want to let you know is we're not going to go in depth about horrible things. That's not our plan. But just do be aware that we are going to talk about horror in general, and we are running a D&D horror campaign. So we're not going to talk about gore. We're not going to talk about, all of the things that may trigger you. But just be warned that we are talking about this topic. Anything you want to add along those lines?
No, I think that's great. So yeah, we're looking at chapter 4. I think specifically because when we look at what the book, and we'll talk about the overview of what the book has. When we look at what the book has, it does what all D&D books kind of want to do. It starts with character options because that's how you get the players to buy this book and get a diverse audience buying it. It's easier to sell your DMs on it, so you put the DM info in the back. But the DM info is actually, I think, really important for anyone to read, not just the DMs, because it sets the tone of what all this is about, of what it's like to have horror in D&D. So that's what we're going to start with. But yeah, I think we should talk, or maybe just mention what the outline of this book is like.
Okay. So the overview of the book, it has 5 chapters plus the spirit board. Chapter 1 talks about character creation, which gives general information. And then it goes into character mechanics, such as lineages, dark gifts. There is a new subclass option for the bard and the warlock, new backgrounds, and trinkets that have sort of a creepy horror aspect to them. What's in Chapter 2?
Yeah, so Chapter 2 is all about the creation of a domain of dread. And I thought this was interesting that they start with creation before the domains themselves. And maybe that's a good way to sort of answer. It's probably just good all around to say, hey, here's how to make your domain of dread. Later, we're going to show you the ones that, sort of are canonical. And that lets you make one that they decided not to cover that might have been in older products, or to make your own. So I like that organization there. And as part of this Chapter 2, they're also talking about the genres of horror, because as we've said in previous shows, what they've taken the approach with, how they've taken the approach with their domains is that each domain is a type of horror. And that lets them focus the experience, and also lets us, the players and the DM, focus that experience. So they talk about the genres of horror: body, cosmic, dark fantasy, folk horror, ghost stories, gothic horror, and then other, as the main types that you can look to use as the influence and underpinning of your domain.
Cool. Chapter 3 then goes into specific domains within Ravenloft. This is sort of the gazetteer of the different domains. So it gives general information on the myths themselves, which make all of this possible, and give you domains, 17 detailed domains, plus some brief snippets of information on several others. And then they give NPC information, different organizations that exist within domains or across domains or within the myths themselves. Chapter 4, the chapter we're going to discuss, talks about horror adventures. We're going to review that. And then Chapter 5 talks about the monsters of Ravenloft, giving you some new monsters to play around with.
Yeah, pretty neat. And then we get, as you mentioned, the spirit board, which is a new tool, the way that we had the Taroka cards that were used in the classic Ravenloft. So now we get a sort of Ouija board experience to have there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so we will now delve deep into Chapter 4, and we're going to start with a quote. The tools and techniques in this chapter provide ways to make sure your game is both spooky and safe in ways right for your specific group. A toolbox of horror-focused rules also provides options for what sort of grim adventures you might create. At the end of this chapter, a horror adventure puts these methods to use and leads characters on their first steps into the domains of dread. So there you go. They're going to tell us how to run a spooky but safe game. And I want to step back all the way back and talk about the problem with horror in D&D. The problem with horror in D&D is we get instructions right away not to terrify the players, but to terrify the characters. So therefore it becomes an exercise in role-playing someone who is scared rather than being scared yourself. Every other horror-based medium really is about you being scared. If you read a Stephen King novel, you're reading it because when you turn out the light, you're thinking what's under the bed. When you go on a roller coaster, you're going to have your guts lifted up into your throat and to feel that vertigo. When you watch a horror movie, you want to be scared. You want that adrenaline rush. That's why most people go. So this is the opposite of all of that. This is pretending that you're scared, which for me doesn't have any of the juice that any of those other things has. So I'm trying now to understand why even bother with horror in D&D, or why call it out specifically when you already have mind flayers and aboleths and ghosts and all of these other things. So I want to get that perspective out there right away, because I am not the target audience for this sort of thing. I like the idea of Gothic stories, and stories that are sort of weird and mysterious and out of the norm. But in terms of straight horror, that's something different to me.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I agree with you. I'm the same way. And what's interesting to me is I think that all this discussion about Ravenloft, it's been interesting listening to, like, say, the official podcast. Both hosts sort of say, like, yeah, I'm not really super into scary stuff. And they'll have guests on, and the majority of them are sort of like, yeah, I don't super love the scary stuff. And then they had a guest on, and she was like, yeah, I'm super into body horror. So you have such a variance in what people want out of their experience. And I think that's a really important consideration. And I almost would have talked about this up front. There is a lot here that says different people like different things, but maybe to even start and say that what is a horror experience is very different for each person. And as you said, like, I love a cool Gothic tale. I love a tale of sorrow. You know, my favorite horror stories are ones where there's this tragic underpinning, and that story is really interesting to peel back and resolve. That kind of, you know, these mysteries, those kinds of elements. But, you know, other people want that kind of really tough experience. And I think that's why games like Dread, or, you know, other games like that where there is an actual sort of terrifying mechanic to it, and you know you will all die. Or even Cthulhu, right? The classic "we will go insane," right? When you play various versions of that game, you know, to find out what's going on is to lose the game, and you're heading towards that direction. Sort of and happily so, right?
Right. I was going to bring up Call of Cthulhu, because trying to get long-term D&D players, trying to get them to play Call of Cthulhu or a Cthulhu-like game, where it's not, are we going to die? It's how are we going to die / lose our minds.
Right.
Many players, a vast majority of those players enjoyed the experience for it like a one shot.
Yeah.
But they knew what the end was going to be, and they just couldn't get into it.
Which is especially fascinating. If I can just add that back when you and I sort of started, our characters were dying all the time in D&D. And yet even then, the idea of playing a character that you know is going to die was a hard thing for people to deal with. And I think it probably is even harder today to think of. You know, we saw this at Tomb of Annihilation even. The idea that, like, well, your character will probably die. A lot of players go, wait, what? It's not what I want out of this.
Right, exactly. And there are definitely players who can make that switch. Okay, I'm playing D&D now. My whole goal is to succeed and reach my goals, get to the highest level I can, become the god or whatever that goal is.
Yeah.
And then they can go play Call of Cthulhu and say, okay, different mindset, different game. And that's going back to Wes Snyder's design blog, where he said, we didn't want to make D&D something other than D&D, which I applauded. They shouldn't. You should play D&D because you like D&D and what it brings. And I don't want to try to cram some other structure on D&D to make it work for horror. But then it becomes problematic about how do you do horror with D&D. So to get into what... go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think I was thinking the same thing as you, which is, all right, so what is this book trying to do? And this book spends a fair amount of space for what an RPG book is, at least 6 pages on this idea of preparing for horror and running horror games, and then kind of how to end a session. And it may not perfectly address all of these issues, but I think it does a pretty good job at giving you different angles to look at the situation for, so that I think most players and most DMs who read this will come out of it with good understanding and some concepts around, some ideas around how to change their game up to make up for these challenges.
Mm-hmm. And really, most of what they say in these 6 pages is the same thing that you would get from any game, saying, run a session 0, put safety tools in place. It's really detailed, really good advice that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with horror. There are parts that say, talk about what horror means and what's too much and what's not enough. But you can also do that with violence. You can also do that with sexual content. You can also do that with any sort of content that you're putting in D&D. What's too much? What's too little? So it is great advice. It's just not necessarily specific to horror in general. And the second point I was going to make is I love the thought of preparing for horror. Right? It's like preparing for the unpreparable. Right? Horror is like there, and this is like, okay, prepare for something that is going to be shocking.
Well,
I don't know.
I think that some of what this book does, and I mean it's overdue because these are all topics we wouldn't even talk about when D&D was new, when Ravenloft was first out. And that is to say that, being aware that people are touched by topics in many different ways. And unless you talk to your players, and unless you think about it as a DM, you won't know what those boundaries should be to make things more fun. And you can just see a simple example is, if you mention insects, some people are really uncomfortable with them. And just putting them in a game, they'd really rather you didn't. I love insects. Sure. I love spiders. I will gladly, have any kind of interaction with them. And so it's like, if they're in an adventure, I'm sort of like, oh, it's too bad. We've got to kill them. Whereas someone else really their reaction is, why is this in the game? Let's not. Yeah. And so it talks about, there are a whole series of pieces here when it comes in this section, preparing for horror, where it talks about setting the expectations, having a horror content survey where we, and it gives us a whole bunch of questions. What should the content and theme be? What do we want to see during the gameplay? That are helpful. And a good example of this is in a couple places they talk about your player losing control over their character. Right, losing that agency. And this is something we see a lot in horror. A person is bound and held down while something creepy happens. You are held in stasis. You're taken over by a spirit. And any number of variations on that. This is a common part of horror. And some people are really into that. And some people are like, I really don't want that to happen. or I want it to happen and in ways that I can say, okay, that's enough, right? And so having those kinds of gameplay questions are very useful.
And that is important, and it is something that does need to be talked about. But it's even more subtle than that in some cases, with this sort of losing control of your character, which is losing control of the rules that govern your character. So we're moving sort of from the psychological to just the game mechanical. When you know that your character can do X, Y, and Z. Yes, I'm never at disadvantage because I'm always attacking with advantage because of this thing I have. Oh, wait, now I have a curse where I'm always at disadvantage. That's not a psychological thing. That's a game mechanical thing. But that is as stressful for some people as any sort of psychological fear would be, because of the control that they love to have in their game. So that's something that needs to be discussed as well with your group if you're going to use mechanics like fear or stress.
Yeah. And the story angle, I mean, there are many horror movies where, the person who is the good person and, the protagonist, one of the main, one of those main heroes, wakes up covered in blood. Oh, who'd you kill? Right? And watching that is one experience, and it's horrifying and suspenseful and mysterious, but we don't necessarily want our character to commit an atrocity that we didn't actually have a say in, because the game is about having a say in what your character does. The whole idea is that you are the hero. So it's good. Those are just all examples of things you want to talk through as to whether they're fun or not. And I think just even that having the conversation, even if the characters are like, well, we trust you, let's play it by ear, the fact that you've all thought through it will make it easier for someone at the table to feel comfortable saying, you know what, can we kind of fade to black here, or can we fast forward this, or have this not go further? And also the DM is more likely to be thinking in their mind, this scene I'm doing may intrude a bit, and maybe I'll check in. How's everybody doing? Let's take a quick snack break.
Because one of the points that Wes made in that article was that in a horror game, the DM and the players are co-conspirators in the horror. Just as they should be co-conspirators in telling the story of a D&D game. They should be co-conspirators in creating this horror atmosphere, which we are going to talk about next, which is running horror games. While preparing and running frightening adventures, keep in mind the ebb and flow of suspense, atmosphere, pacing, description, and player involvement all influence a game's tension and directly contribute to how scary your adventures feel. So let's break down some of those words: atmosphere, pacing, description, and so on.
Yeah, horror atmosphere. It's interesting how they write about this. So they talk about the mood of your game and the overall tone that the game has to it. Is it levity, excitement, dread? And we're given various topics to consider. One of them, this is not the first place it comes up in this book, accessibility. And I don't know that there probably has been some mention, because D&D is vast and wide, of accessibility in old products, but not to the extent that we see here. And this is really quite remarkable that we see a really careful consideration of accessibility issues in this chapter. So a reminder that you have to consider accessibility needs with other factors. Like if you're bringing in some, dim lighting, well, now folks with bad eyesight can't easily read, right? And it may be differently hard for different people to the point where it's not enjoyable. Loud music, if you have auditory issues, and so on. And so it goes through all these different considerations. They talk about things like the location. If you're trying to run a spooky game in your favorite local gaming store, that's harder than if you do it in your basement room and you've set up candles and drawn the curtains and right. But if your neighbor's mowing outside the window, it's that'll take you out of it a bit.
That's a different kind of horror.
And to even
yes,
I'm learning about your neighbors. Remove decor that takes away from the game. They talk about music, which is always an interesting thing. Lighting. Props, and I like that the thing they say about props. Their first rule is don't overdo it.
Yeah,
they make a good point, which is that props are great, but don't just work so hard on it that the game hinges just on that.
Right.
But that small things can go a long way. Things like distractions. If everyone's on the phone, is that going to pull you out of the mood? So discuss compromises that benefit everyone. And then the idea that Dungeon Master models the behavior for others. So use your voice tones to match the intensity and excitement of the scene. Create suspense. Be into it so that everybody else can follow your lead. Yeah. What do you think about this piece?
Yeah, it never fails to astound me at how close DMing is to teaching. Because all of these things you could say about a classroom. In terms of getting the point across, but not with no distractions. You can't do certain things because of different accessibility issues, and don't overdo certain things because then you're taking the focus away from the lesson you're trying to teach and putting it on the cool prop that you made. All of these things are so true, and they fit for not just horror games, but regular games and basically life in general. So, that's what I thought as I was reading all of this.
That's great. That's a good point. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So next they talk about horror pacing. They say everything can't be scary and continuous terror is unsustainable. Before players grow numb to endless tension, create opportunities for them to catch their breath and regain a temporary feeling of calm. The best horror adventures are like roller coasters. They ratchet up suspense and then release it, building toward the next harrowing moment. Also mix up social interaction, exploration, combat, and other types of encounters to create interesting and engaging pacing. Ensure that scenes are always somehow relevant to your story and move characters toward their goals. And I read this and I'm like, yes, and every adventure should be like that, not just horror adventures. Right. Now, they do make the point of don't just have horror, but also don't just have anything in your adventures.
Yeah, I think I made a note about this down below that I like this. This is all good advice, and I'm not sure if it's tangible enough to the reader. And I think that it may have been helpful, and I know it's always hard with space. You can't devote all the space to these things, but to really give an example of how this should play out. And this is where I think it can end up different than your typical adventure, though I would argue, yes, all adventurers should look at this and think about this, and all adventure writers and DMs should think about this. But this idea of you can't have endless tension is really key, and it's easy. I remember being a young DM, and I would think to myself, oh, this is going to be just, a horror trap fest. And you just keep going away at them, and at some point they really do become numb to it because it's just, well, yes, another hallway full of a horrible trap, and we're supposed to be scared, and you just can't sustain it. And instead, I think the book could have really painted the picture of what horror movies do to be effective, or horror novels do to be effective, where we will start with unease, right? The barest glimpse of something being wrong. Stranger Things, right? I'm going to ride my bike home, and it is dark, and there's like a noise, and what's going on, and then something else happens that out of place to let us know that something is wrong, and ratchet up that tension a bit, that suspense. And then usually something happens where it's like, oh, we're going to see it. We're going to see the bad thing. And then it's like your cat was, made the mop fall or something like that, right? It's something mundane. And so there's this release. And then we go, wait a minute, something else is, and it builds like that, right? That's the roller coaster effect. Yeah. And if we see something that's actually brutal and horrid, it's usually a glimpse of it, right? A severed, the villager that's just wiped out. right? But we only just saw a clawed hand. And all of this builds up to the point where everybody around the table is having an actually exciting time, and is really prepared for what comes next, right? That way that you put those things together, that is the art of it, and especially important with this kind of horror.
Yep. So that's all of that is true, and you can even make that effect not necessarily through the events, but just through your delivery. So they give the suggestion to slow down your pace to draw out the tension. And so, as these strange things are happening, you're slowing down your voice, and the players are waiting and waiting for the next thing to happen. And then you can talk quickly, and that jolts them back to the sense of, okay, what's happening now? And all of that is just a useful tool to get your pacing sorted out ahead of time.
Can I say on pacing that I think one of it should be like in every DM's sort of training manual, so to speak, is to watch the episodes of the TV show Community where they play D&D, and the DM Abed, he uses this technique, and it's just how it's being done for television, but he actually controls the players' roles. But what it means is that he's very quickly going back and forth. There's to be like, Shawn, your attack whizzes past the goblin's head. 3 orcs move forward from the east. Okay, Jim, what do you do? Right? And it just goes back and forth between everybody. But it's really quick like that, and it's super exciting to watch it. And it makes you realize, oh yeah, if I hit that pace during really exciting moments, and I go back and forth between characters like that, like that's really gets it going, right? Makes it feel exciting.
Right. And another way to do that is to talk quickly while you're talking to the characters, but then when you're describing what the monsters do, then slow things down, because that gives the characters this sense of everything's going so fast, but then time slows down when the monster acts, and they have to watch everything it does and describe in detail its movements. But then when you go back to the characters, go quick again, and that's a super fun way to do things. Let's see. Parallel scenes. They suggest splitting the party and cutting back and forth. I agree most of the time that splitting the party doesn't necessarily slow things down unless you have a lot of description that you need to do. So, yes, it's true that even when the party's split, you can give everyone equal time, but there is a lag as you set the scene for one player or one group of players while the others aren't able to take part. And if they're paying attention, that's great. If they're a group, if they're a player that can be in on the scene even though their characters aren't, and they're listening and they're engaged, then split them all. Have 7 different things going on at once. That's fine. But if they sort of tune out when another person is in the spotlight, it can quickly degenerate into a lack of attention.
Yeah. And that's another thing that the DM can help with, is making things really clear, because it's true. If you're thinking that cutscene, Kate, what do you do? And if Kate has to say, all right, tell me about the room again. What's it look like?
Yep.
And there are how many spirits floating? Where are they? Could you drop, say, oh, okay. And we do all this. And then, we're not having that director's cut feel, because we have to go over everything again. And that's on us, right, where we want to make it all digestible. And this idea of parallel scenes, splitting the party can be tough. And of course, it's such a horror trope that sometimes players will just think, like, we're not splitting up. That's how they'll kill us. But you can do this by, say, having a big room, right? If you think of like a warehouse type place. And so one person is drawn to go, what's under these, blankets, and someone else wants to look at the odd machine. And you can cut back and forth between them to create that feeling, but everybody's in the same room. And that makes it easier because you still have all the elements there and everybody's nearby, but you treat it like a cut scene like in that way. Yep.
And it
gives you that sense of
Go ahead.
I was going to say, it gives you a sense of things that are evolving. So, as the person's pulling the curtains, the other person's messing with the machine, and someone else goes to look at the examination table. And all of this creates that feeling of fluidity and suspense, because any one of these could turn out to be important and exciting. So it's a good way to do it.
And it may seem obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. If you do that, even if you have to change the adventure or the description, time it so that as you're cutting back and forth, everything is culminating to its peak at the same time. So don't let the one character pull back the sheet to reveal the zombie and then go back to the other character who's, fidgeting with something else. Have all of these things that are about to go wrong happen. Put the zombie, under the sheet. Put a zombie behind the door. Put a zombie under the bed. And as everyone's investigating, they all come out at the same time.
And those are great scenes. We see that in movies all the time, where people are doing different things and they all go wrong at the same time, right? And even the person who maybe hasn't quite taken their action, they were going to pull the sheet off of something and the sheet just falls on its own, right? So they're looking over what their friend is doing, and then they turn back to what they were going to do, and there's this horrible thing there that has removed its sheet from itself, and so it ends up being at the same time, right? So there are tricks like that you can do. And you can look at good scenes in an entirely new light if you think of it as a DM and what if this were an adventure. It gives you a real feel for what the directors are doing in these scenes, right, to make it all work and be exciting.
For sure. A couple other points here under pacing. They talk about reliability and trust, saying don't betray the party all the time. You can state that someone is trustworthy, and then it's about whether the party can keep those trustworthy NPCs safe. So again, it's don't keep going back to the same well every time. Although, there should be some sense of betrayal at some point, especially if the characters don't do the things they need to do to keep the trust of the NPCs. Right? If the characters abuse these NPCs, the NPC could just as easily go to the castle of the Count and say, listen, I know these heroes are after you. They're not being nice to me, so I'll give you them if you be nice to me. Maybe that's something, all of these things, while it's a good tip, it doesn't have to be a hard and fast rule depending on the story that you're telling. All they really mean is, by saying reliability and trust, is there should be some safe space for the characters. There should be an anchor on which they know will be there, because they need that to have some hope in this otherwise hopeless situation. And that takes us to the last point, which is just enough hope.
Yeah. Before you get to that, I just want to say that I think there was it was a podcast I think Kenneth Haidt was doing many moons ago, and it was about the idea of mysteries and red herrings, and it was more like spy genre type. But the point of it was that you only want so many kind of question threads that the players are following in trying to unravel what's going on, and only want so many red herrings. And the way to think of it, and TV shows and novels do this as well, is you have a few possibilities that are out there. And as you resolve one, then you give a little bit of time, and then you introduce another. But you can't just overwhelm. And the same thing with this reliability and trust angle. If everybody's always backstabbing you, you will never trust anybody, and you just won't want to relate to NPCs. Yeah. And what the horror genre usually does well is that people are weak. And the horror genre tends to exacerbate that, right? So if we have, one of the 7 deadly sins as sort of an archetype draped over an NPC, they might fall to this in a certain situation. Their greed or their lust or their fear, right? These kinds of things, they fall apart, and they do things, and it's not necessarily because you can't trust any NPC, but more that these are tough situations. So you can use all those variants to regulate it. What you just don't want is you don't want players who just refuse to interact with any NPC because they know they're going to get punished for it. And then don't create that kind of a game.
True. And the last bit, well, the next to the last bit is just enough hope. So, fear without hope leads to apathy. So don't use impossible situations all the time. Don't have the characters rescued by NPCs. Reward characters who do the heroic and dramatic things and who lean into the horror as opposed to resist it. And then end on cliffhangers is the final bit of advice for pacing. So it's pretty obvious. It's a normal D&D thing. Oh, we're going to end this session just as you're about to go over the cliff, or just as you're about to enter this battle. And here we go. Let's see, what else do they talk about here? They talk about describing horror. You want to lead us through this?
This is near and dear to my heart. The whole idea that you don't describe the monster, right off the bat. You build up to it. Any horrible thing, give glimpses, ease into it so that more and more is being provided. That makes it way scarier to people. I remember even when we played, I ran my kids through the first Tyranny of Dragons adventure that you wrote, and there's that one where they go into the mausoleum and descend. Mm-hmm. Right. And just the way that was described, they were really kind of, they were like, is this going to be too much? And I'm like, no, this will be fine. But I had to kind of relax them and take a little pause, because it was just that in anticipation. That's the beauty of it, is our brains fill that space, right? And so just give little bits, and the players will do that. And I liked here they had this comment to not describe a thing fully. I can't find it in the notes, but they talked about like the vampire, describe its eyes. Mm-hmm. And the players will fill in the rest of the description. You don't actually have to. If you just focus on one horrible aspect of it, the truth is that the players will provide the rest of the description themselves, which is great.
Yeah, and another bit of advice along those lines is describe the other senses before the sense of sight, because that most people, I think, are more visually inclined than any of the other senses. So if you deny that with other descriptions, it lets their imaginations roam a little bit further than it normally would if you start out with a visual description.
Yeah, and they have there's good advice here, right? Like before it arrives, foreshadow its approach. Things like the weather, nature, if there's a deer in the road and suddenly it just bolts, right? Or strange lights, shadows lengthen, right? All that kind of thing makes it really exciting. The sounds it makes, how it smells, how it breathes. Does it change the air around it? How does it stand? What does its touch feel like? That's a kind of cool one, right? Something creepy, yep. And the monk goes and punches it. Well, what's that feel? What's it sound like to punch or whatever, right? That's
next, we have horror gameplay. We get into the mechanical game aspects of D&D and how they can influence horror. So, do we want to get into this now, or do we want to wait till next time?
What's the timing here? I think we could maybe do this. Yeah, we're close. Why don't we push through?
Okay, cool. You have horror threats, where the genre often nullifies the hero's strengths. In D&D, that may not be the fun that the players want to have, and that's sort of what I described earlier, of taking away their abilities, which they've counted on when they created their characters. So do you want to sort of walk us through the bullets here?
They give a few examples of how we can do these real gameplay aspects to make them work. So, if you think of a vampire, sometimes in novels or in television, it's like this creature is unkillable. Super speed and vulnerable kinds of stuff, just too much. And so they're saying balance immunity to common PC tactics with vulnerability to something else. So focus on that unlocking. If we can't kill the mummy with our blades, oh wait, maybe it's fire, right? And so go to the torches, and that makes it fun. Having monsters do creepy things which you wouldn't do in other genres. So like, what if the cultists all spend their action chanting to a sinister god? That's really creepy, right? And could be well worth it and make the encounter a whole lot more fun, even though they didn't take actions to attack the party that round, right? It could actually end up being more fun for that. Yeah. I love this. Use a lesser monster that the party thinks is the threat, and then the actual threat shows up and just tears apart that monster.
Right.
And just eats it, right? It's like the T-Rex eating the smaller dino kind of scene. Like, that's the bad thing? Let's get out of here. And one that's really good: have foes play dead and then return to life. And there's a lot you can do with that kind of. You could have a shadow or spirit type thing like seem to dissipate, but then it just creeps up from behind. I mean, those kinds of things are all really fun to do.
Yeah. No, I mean, all those are good advice, and again, they're good advice whether you're doing horror or doing anything else. Just to sort of change things up, to make things different in this particular adventure or in this particular encounter, to keep the players on their toes, to keep them from getting too settled in without completely ripping the reality of the game out from under them.
Yeah. There's a sidebar on Subverting Cliches. This includes things like, and I think it's things that D&D itself has had to learn as it's been writing the story of Ravenloft and other horror areas. When you paint the culture like everybody's exactly from the same, has the same kind of characteristics and approaches and thoughts. So don't do that. Treat characters like real people with real motivations, with variance. Vary your genders, ethnicities, sexualities, beliefs, disabilities. Don't use cliche accents to represent marginalized peoples. We saw this in Rhyme with Frost Maiden. But, that idea of really taking this to heart and thinking through this so that you have a better game. There's some advice here about the typical D&D session being longer than a typical horror movie, which I thought was an interesting. I'm like, oh, yeah, 4 hours is longer than a movie, and so to think about how sustaining that atmosphere can be difficult. So take breaks, check in, encourage players to step away when they need it. And that's good to think about that kind of pacing and how it all feels. I know even with Tomb of Annihilation, when I was running that sense that any step could be your last was heavy for some of the players. And towards the end of the campaign, there was at least one player who I think kind of, wanted us to fast forward a bit, kind of like, this has been a little stressful. And it's funny because you want it to be a little stressful because, I mean, it's Tomb of Annihilation, but you also don't want it to be not fun. And so we would talk often, sort of, how are we doing? And the reality is, I think if the campaign had gone longer, they probably would have been like, this is too much for me. But they knew the end was coming, and that, and what it told me as DM is I did not escalate the toughness. I kept it where it was, because to escalate, I think would have been, would have been too much. So there's a lot here. They mentioned the X card, how to engage players, and this is one that the way the advice is written is a little. I could have used maybe a slight different explanation, but so it talks about if someone isn't engaged, check in. And I think what it could have noted is not all players engage. And so I think the real question is, if someone is not engaging the way they normally would, then that's where you want to really say, hey, how's it going for you? Because some people are more observer type of players, and that's all just fine. It's what they want to do. That's perfectly legitimate. But some people might be a sign that if it's a change, then it could be a sign that something has gone wrong. You want to see what's going on there.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Is not just check in, but check in especially when you see a difference in behavior from a player.
Yeah. But this is all good. I mean, I think that they could have gone back also here and mentioned that the idea of that survey at the beginning of your game or in a session 0 discussion where you say, hey, what is everybody liking? Go back and do that survey again after, 4 sessions, after the, even every 4, something like that. And just how are we all doing? What are we liking is good in any kind of campaign, but especially a horror campaign. And there's this last section here, which is after the horror, that just says, check in with players at the end of a session, and we are given some ideas on questions to ask. So it's that same kind of concept. And it's not a bad thing. A lot of times when we're wrapping up, it's like we've reached the end of the game time and people need to go, especially as you have older players that have responsibilities, work the next day, and everybody really wants to get in their car and drive home. But if you can spend, or turn off the Zoom, if you can spend those moments to sort of see how people are feeling, that is a good thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this again goes back to education, right? This is what I'm going to teach you. Okay, I am teaching you this. This is what I have taught you. Did you learn what I said I was going to teach you? And if you didn't, why didn't you learn what I said I was going to teach you? Same thing here. This is what our game is going to be. Everyone good with that? Yeah. Is this what our game was? Is everyone good with that? It's just good communication. Good interpersonal conflict resolution skills all around.
Yeah, that's all really good advice. And the better campaigns, I think I run better campaigns as I learn to communicate better with my players, unquestionably so. And so the more that you are having this dialogue, the more that you understand where they're coming from, what they're enjoying, what they're not enjoying, and how to go in the right direction.
Yep.
So that's everything that's in this first part of this chapter before they get to sort of tools and the Tarokka deck and Spirit board. I did want to say that the advice that we've covered, there is something similar that this reminded me of, which is the Fate Horror Toolkit, which is created by Evil Hat. You can find it on Drive-Thru or at the Evil Hat store. It's $10, platinum bestseller on Drive-Thru. And it has tools, tips, themes, aspects, compels, which are an interesting tool that I think they're going to sort of use here a little bit.
Yep.
But that's another, this is it's like 100-something pages full of really good advice on this kind of running horror. So if you're looking for more and you want a slightly different take on how to approach horror games, there's a lot of advice that's game independent. So it doesn't matter if you're not running Fate, if you're running D&D, this is helpful to you. So I do recommend that Fate Horror Toolkit. It's a neat product. And
yeah, for sure. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from other role-playing games, and Fate is a really good one to teach some lessons about running games and character interaction and so on. Yep. Sweet. So we will continue more of our discussion about Van Richten's guide next time. But I want to thank everybody for listening out there. If you would like to support our show, you can do so by going to patreon.com/MMP to give us a little bit to keep the lights on, keep our mics warm. And thank you to those patrons who are already pledging some support. Teos, where can people find you on social media?
You can find me on my blog at alphastream.org. Join my mailing list as I prepare for some neat stuff, and I'll give you something free if you sign up. And then on the Twitterverse, you can find me at AlphaStream. How about you, Shawn?
You can find me on Twitter at Shawn Merwin, or at the forums at forums.misdirectedmark.com. And you can also follow the show's Twitter account at Mastering D&D. Mastering Dungeons is a Misdirected Mark production, the media arm of Encoded Designs. So, Mr. Abadia, now that we have figured out how to run a horror adventure, what are we going to do now?
We are going to follow the cackling sounds around that dark corner. And then where we see all those hanging sheets, we'll peel one back and we'll stab it. Whatever it may be.
See? You see what he did there? That's a master DM.